Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. Faced with the really dire crisis that has been produced by COVID-19, a health crisis, an economic crisis and a social crisis, we needed a budget that would support decisive action to defeat the threat of COVID-19 as a threat to public health, and we needed decisive action to support the workers, the livelihoods and the families who have been most severely impacted as a result of the economic fallout of COVID-19, and this budget has failed on all of those counts. The headline figures sound great, but as soon as you look into the detail, it is clear that the budget, despite significant increases in expenditure, doesn't actually do what is absolutely necessary in terms of dealing with the threat of COVID-19. The decision not to restore the PUP and the wage subsidy scheme, which the government cut, is nothing short of a disgrace and a very dangerous mistake, as infection rates are rising and the prospect of tens and hundreds of thousands of people potentially losing again employment and jobs if further restrictions are imposed is a really serious undermining of the collective social solidarity that we need to deal with the threat of COVID-19. It was bad enough that people had to endure months of hardship, of lost income, of unemployment as a result of public health restrictions on a payment of €350, but to have to potentially go through that again, or for some people nothing has changed because their particular jobs mean their income is on the floor or their employment has ceased altogether, for them to continue through this crisis and for others now possibly to join them as a result of new health restrictions or further health restrictions and in an even worse financial position, is absolutely disgraceful and unacceptable. How are people supposed to pay their rent, their mortgage, their bills, if their income has been slashed or if their opportunities for employment have been massively reduced? And in the case of particular sectors that I've mentioned as nauseam, groups like taxi drivers, musicians, people in the arts and events sector who are on the PUP, then had the PUP cut, or have no prospect of returning to work at any time in the future or having anything like a full recovery of their sectors as long as the pandemic is with us, and they are going to continue on reduced payments. Now, while there is talk of an income subsidy where they'll be able to earn over and above that, there's a problem. First of all, a lot of people are on different levels of payment, some on 200, some on 250, some on 300. But then I believe there's going to be a cap of 120 a week on how much they can earn, and it's not clear if you reach that cap, then do you lose your entire payment. But in any event, there's virtually no work out there at the moment, and they are, in actuality, going to have to survive on reduced payments. And now, on top of that, they are going to have to pay additional VRT if their vehicles are old. They're going to have to pay additional car tax, and they're going to have to pay additional costs on fuel because of the decision to increase carbon tax. All regressive taxes, further increasing the economic financial pressure on people who've already had their income and employment devastated. It is cruelly unfair, I put it to the government, to do that to people who've been hardest hit by the pandemic, but it is also a dangerous undermining of the principle of we're all in it together and the social solidarity we need in order to address the COVID-19 threat, even more so when we're likely to face more restrictions over the coming weeks. And you add to that the disgraceful decision to lift the mortgage moratorium and to lift the ban on evictions. If it was not justified to have banks crawling all over the backs of people who'd lost jobs and incomes in March and April, how is it justified to do it now when many of those people are in the same or in a worse financial position than they were a few months ago? How could it possibly be justified to make people homeless? It's absolutely unconscionable. The public health threat is now very close to every bit as bad as it was in March and April, and is heading in a very negative direction. So how can it be justified in any shape or form to allow people to be made homeless by landlords? It's absolutely unacceptable. The government should immediately reinstate the mortgage moratorium. They should immediately reinstate the eviction ban and should absolutely guarantee that nobody will be made homeless during the course of the pandemic, although of course nobody should face homelessness at any time in any society that calls itself a civilised society. And on that I want to address the housing measures in the budget. Again, you look at the headline figures, sounds impressive. But then you compare and contrast what the government is promising with what was in Owen Murphy's failed Rebuilding Ireland plan. And lo and behold, you find it's the same plan. Nothing has really changed. So we are told in the budget, when you read the fine print beyond the headlines, 15,000 extra HAP tenancies and 800 additional RAS tenancies, bringing us up to 85,000 HAPs and RAS tenancies by the end of the year, costing us €2.4 billion, straight into the pockets of private landlords for housing that is not secure and is crucifying in terms of the cost to the taxpayer and to the public coffers, and at which at any time those landlords can pull out of those RAS and HAPS deals, as they often do, plunging those families in so-called social housing into homeless situations. And indeed, many of the people who are in emergency accommodation at the moment are people who've been put out again and again from HAPS and RAS tenancies because of landlords pulling out of the deals. That figure of 85,000 HAP tenancies at an absolutely extraordinary and shocking figure of 2.4 billion cost is exactly the same figure as in the original Rebuilding Ireland. So in other words, we continue with the failed policy of relying on the private landlords in order to deliver housing instead of the direct construction of public housing. Also, there is some incredible spin. If people do their maths, they can work this one out very quickly. We are told in the budget statement 500 million to deliver 9,500 newly constructed units. Now, if you do the maths, that works out at 52,000 per unit. You cannot build a house of any description for €52,000. So what does that mean? It means we're not getting 9,500 units, which has been generally the case because none of the targets have ever been met, or, in fact, this is linked to the recommitment to the Land Development Agency, whose whole modus operandi is to essentially privatise public land or involve private finance in the delivery of social housing on public land, where substantial amounts of that land is actually given over to the private sector to profiteer from public housing. So that is a very worrying fact. Then, of course, on the critical issue of healthcare. Again, eye-watering figures at one level in terms of the increased expenditure in health, but then you start to look at the detail. Currently, we have 280 ICU beds, which we are perilously close to those beds being overrun if the infection rates continue to go at the current rate that they are. That, by the way, is less than the 350 ICU in surge capacity that we had in April, when our ICUs were largely overrun. And in this plan, we are planning to go up to only 320 permanent capacity, but that is half sorry, not half, but it is very considerably less than the 560 ICU beds that HSE told us we needed in 2009 before we had COVID-19. So we are so far short of having the ICU capacity that we need to actually deal with any significant surge in COVID-19, which almost certainly we are going to face. We continue to have in the winter plan €58 million to go out to the private hospitals to essentially rent at extortionate costs private healthcare capacity, when, if we are actually going to deal with this crisis, there should be no question of a two-tier health system or any private healthcare providers profiteering from it, but we should be taking those private hospital capacities directly into public control, so we have a single-tier integrated health response to COVID-19. And of course, absolutely critical, if we do drive down the virus as we need to, in order to get back to some sort of normality, we need a testing and tracing regime that is actually able to control and keep ahead of the virus. And that would mean moving way beyond the 100,000 tests we're doing now to about 200,000 and resourcing that, and have a tracing regime that actually works and is properly staffed. And here I'll give you a shocker. We had figures from Paul Reid at a leaders' briefing the other day about the permanent recruitment of tracers to the HSE, replacing the ones that were essentially seconded in. But then I got an email from somebody who's just been recruited into one of these positions as a tracer, and what sort of contract are they getting? Unbelievably, 0-hour contracts. 0-hour contracts for our tracers, where they have no guarantee of the hours that they will work. They essentially won't get hours unless they are needed, where they will get no sick pay and will be put on the PUP payment if they get sick as a result of COVID-19. Absolutely disgraceful. That is the way we're treating the people that we urgently need to recruit into the testing and tracing regime we need to deal with COVID-19. It is completely outrageous. The mental health spend, again, you look at the figure, 38 million extra for mental health, when our people are going through a terrible situation in terms of mental health, might sound on paper good until you discover that when you add that to the entire budget, the actual proportion of the health budget that will be spent on mental health will be less percentage-wise in 2021 than it was in 2020. And of course, that's against a background where we spend only 5% of our budget on mental health, as against an average across Europe of about 12%, which is what we need to actually deal with people with mental health problems and providing the supports and resources that are necessary, and even more so in the situation of COVID-19. I mentioned a few other things. In the Department of Enterprise and Employment, there seems to be a very significant drop in the allocation that is going to that department when you look at the estimates book, and that's particularly worrying when you think about the grants that are needed for the lone traders, the self-employed and the small SMEs who are not getting still the grant support that they actually need to sustain them through the current crisis, where the costs of rents, of insurance, of all the sort of constant overheads that the taxi drivers have, that musicians have, arts workers have, and many other small lone traders who have ongoing costs but no income or very little income coming in, and we have not got significant grant support for them. I'd also like it to be noted that the community development budget has dropped by 16% on 2020, which is quite incredible when you consider we need more support for communities in the face of COVID-19, and that the current expenditure allocation for higher education has also reduced by about 14%. Which seems to me absolutely amazing. I don't even understand it, looking at the estimates, how that could be the case, but it is in the estimates book. I don't know how much time I have left, Paul. 8 minutes. 8 minutes. Okay. I'm in full flight. Now, of course, all of this failure to put the restoration of the PUP and the wage subsidy in place, and the grant support to those particular sectors that desperately need it, contrasts with the continued the continued handout of government money, barely spoken about, to the pampered sections of Irish society, mostly in the form of enormous tax reliefs. And that is really, I think, the outrageous thing. I mean, we all knew there had to be very significant increases in spending in order to deal with the current crisis. The government have made the decision to finance that through borrowing. And let's be absolutely clear, faced with the need to spend, I'd rather borrow than not spend. But the suggestion, of course, that there's no alternatives to borrowing money that ultimately ordinary working people in this country will have to pay back, and we remember the bitter price that we have paid for that in the past, there is an alternative to that, and that is actually to look at the enormous wealth and profits that are being made by a tiny, pampered and super wealthy minority in this country. The latest corporate profit figures for the corporate sector in this country show €180 billion in profits, where they are only paying about 5%, not the 12.5% in tax that they should be paying. Even if we just brought them up to the 12.5%, which would still be one of the lowest levels of corporation tax anywhere in the Western world, indeed almost anywhere in the world, we would get about an extra €10 billion, and they would still be paying an incredibly low level of tax, saving us having to borrow money, but actually redistributing some of that profit. And some of these sectors have actually done extraordinarily well during the period of the pandemic, most notably the pharmaceutical sector, people involved in medical equipment, and some of the big IT companies have actually made super profits over the course of the last year. Surely it would be fair to get them to make a fair contribution to the tax system to actually show the social solidarity and underpin the principle, supposedly the principle of we're all in it together. But of course the truth is, some making super profits, while others who have lost their jobs and employment as a consequence of no fault of their own, are actually on their knees financially and facing a very, very uncertain and difficult future over the coming period. Similarly, you could look at tax reliefs like losses forward, which allow the banks to essentially write off all their profits against tax for the foreseeable future. These tax reliefs should actually be closed down and redirect that money towards ordinary working families, particularly those who are struggling as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. There are a whole number of other potential areas where particularly those who benefited from property development and land speculation, something that has been fueled by government policy, could and should have idle site and vacant property taxes imposed on them in order to address the scandal of land hoarding and the scandal of empty properties lying around in every town and every city of this country, which could be used to provide the desperately needed housing for people who need it, but also indeed to provide the sort of emergency capacity we need in areas like our schools, where we have massively overcrowded schools. The Minister is crowing because he's going to reduce by 1 point the student-staff ratio in our schools, but that's against a background where we have the most overcrowded classrooms in Western Europe, and where, of course, that makes it those classrooms, and particularly the teachers who work in them, far more vulnerable to COVID-19 infection. You look at places like Denmark, where the student-staff ratio isn't 1 to 25, but is 1 to 10, and that is the sort of ratio we should and could be aiming at, and putting in the necessary investment in terms of the recruitment of teachers and the reduction of class sizes. So I'll leave it at that. Yeah.